Right. Hello and welcome. So good to be with you all today. So happy to have this conversation. Regenerative livelihoods for regenerative cultures. And it'll be myself in conversation with Inez Aponte of Growing Good Lives. Want to wave, Inez? Good to see you. Good to be with you. And also thank you to Sylvia representing Gaia Education and supporting us as a host on this. So we are gathered to have this conversation on regenerative livelihoods for regenerative cultures. This is a part of the Cultivating Regenerative Livelihoods course that Sylvia and I have co-created and co-facilitate. We often get to have conversations with folks like Inez who are really doing work around regenerative livelihoods and regenerative cultures. And so we're happy to have this conversation today. We're going to start with just a grounding and arriving, helping us settle and arrive into this call, and then we'll dive into our conversation. So, wherever you are, however you are today in this moment, whatever time zone you're in, just invite us to arrive, to come into presence with one another, to open and to begin our conversation. So, feel free to sit in a way that's comfortable for you. You can have your eyes open or closed. And I'm just going to ring the bell once and we'll take a few moments to settle and arrive. And then I'll ring the bell again and we'll dive into our conversation. All right, thank you. So good to be with you all. So good to be in community this morning. I know there's a lot going on in the world right now. We wanted to kind of presence the challenges and difficulties of our time, particularly what's happening in Israel and Palestine right now. And just, I hope that may this conversation and the ripple effects beyond it really go to supporting regenerative cultures and love and life and regeneration in general. So just good to be in community this morning with you all. And again, I'm Della Duncan, co-creator and co-facilitator of the Cultivating Regenerative Livelihoods course. And I came to know Inez Aponte, who is my guest in conversation today at Schumacher College in England, where she was a guest teacher. And her offering, which is really drawing from the teachings of Manfred Max Neef and others around needs and satisfiers and how we can grow good lives, really was such a refreshing and helpful reframe for my own life and for work in economics around what if the purpose of economics was supporting us to help meet our needs with community sufficiency and resilience and also live in harmony with the more than human world. And so I was really touched by that work and got to interview Inez for the Upstream podcast, which has been a very popular conversation over the years. And then since then, when Sylvia and I co-taught the first Cultivating Regenerative Livelihoods course, we included that conversation with Inez as one of the course materials. And so many folks were so touched or inspired by that work that we thought how wonderful to bring Inez back for a follow-up conversation and a deeper dive into all things related to growing good lives and cultivating regenerative livelihoods in regenerative cultures. So Inez, maybe if you want to start with an introduction and just share a little bit about how you came to this work. And if you can, we've been really working with this theme of a regenerative livelihood garden. So maybe as you introduce yourself, you can share, what are the plants in your regenerative livelihood garden? What are all the ways that you serve and contribute to this time?
Yes, thank you, Della. I'm having, so at the moment I can't, oh, there you are. You seem to be disappearing and coming back again. So I hope that my connection stays solid. So just bear with me. Can you see me okay?
Yes,
You
we can
see me
see and hear
okay?
you okay.
For a moment, everyone disappeared and I could just hear your voice. Technology. I just want to say thank you for inviting me, Della. I was listening to your podcast about regenerative livelihood gardens, and I just wanted to say how beautiful it was to hear that and how beautiful your work is. And I just wanted to express some gratitude for what you've been giving to the world in your podcast and all the work that you're doing. So this idea of a regenerative livelihood garden, I'm just thinking there are so many things that are kind of alive for me, so many flowers in my garden. But I guess the one thing I'm thinking about at the moment is that as well as doing the work that I do with Growing Good Lives, I've embarked on a project to trace some of my colonial ancestors. And so I've got an Arts Council grant to work with the traditional stories from Suriname, which is where my mother is from, and some of my biographical material. So that's a garden that's really, really, that's a flower in my garden that's really, growing at the moment. And I'm doing a lot of work around embodiment. So, and song. So a lot of what's in my garden is singing, embodiment. I started a project with my son a few years ago called Crazy Beautiful World, where we're connecting young people with the elders who care about their future. So my garden is busy with a lot of different things, a lot of different flowers. And then I'm a mother, so I can safely say that pretty much everything I do right now is to protect the future as much as I can for him. And not just the future, also the present, because we are living in the present. And to be with the world as it is in such a way that we can still be aware of the challenges we have and find joy. Because it's really important for us to find joy. So, yeah, I think those are the things that are alive in my garden.
Beautiful. Well, what a thriving and joyful garden. That's wonderful to hear. And so I'm gonna ask some questions of Inez. We're gonna be in conversation for a little, but just to share, we're so grateful to have folks join us. So if you come up with a question or a thought or an insight, we're gonna have some time at the end to hear from others. So just as you hear us sharing and really receive these as invitations yourself to think of your own regenerative livelihood garden, etc., we will love to hear from you in a little bit. So Inez, one of the biggest challenges about cultivating a regenerative livelihood garden or a regenerative livelihood is the challenge of feeling in alignment with our values and maybe a sense of purpose or calling while meeting our needs. This is really the
Yeah.
very, very real tension and challenge for many folks. So I'm just going to recognize and voice that tension. And I just want to ask you how you feel about this tension, how you work with it maybe, and why is it that this is the tension in your understanding? What's kind of the root cause of that?
That's a very good question. I think it's obviously a very complex question, a complex issue. And at the same time, if I think of my own life, so my career really, I've been involved in the arts, storytelling, community engagement. I've always worked with in fields that don't tend to draw a lot of money because I've always wanted to do the things that my heart really called me to do. I've been surrounded by people who are like that. They're musicians, they're poets, they're artists. They do the kind of things that make life worth living, or they're carers, they're teachers. And again, it's that question, like, why is it that the people that are doing all these beautiful things really struggle to feed themselves, to keep a roof over their heads? And I think if you look at it historically, if you think of the way that, I mean, Derek Jensen, he says, no culture, no society would ever willingly give up their land base. So what we need to meet our needs is to have a land base. If we don't have a land base, we are now having to work in the economy to get the money to meet our needs. But this goes back hundreds of years. This is, you know, the sort of dominated cultures of colonialism, where land was taken and people were forced to pay for what they had before. And I think what it is that we've forgotten that that was the kind of original land grab, the original sort of, you know, colonization. And now we've become accustomed to it as being a kind of natural thing. So we've shifted from the understanding of you know, you're born into the world and you should be able to meet your needs in your community, to thinking that, okay, how am I going to become productive in the economy? And we do this indoctrination at a very young age. So by the time you're 6, someone has asked you, what do you want to be when you grow up? And they don't mean, you know, what do you want to contribute to society? What do you want to do to make the world a better place? What do you want to do to really fulfill your longing? What they mean is, what are you going to do that someone's going to pay you for? And if that is the overriding question in our culture for children from a very young age, by the time you're 18, you are fully indoctrinated into a system that says this is the natural course of things. Your worth in this system is how much money you can make. Your status will be determined by that, and that kind of, it's not a sort of sudden thing. I actually think what I think happens is that around teenage, young people start to say, they start to sort of push back against the culture, and I don't think it's just because they're having raging hormones. I think it's because it's the last window of opportunity for them, where they still feel that they want to be able to be themselves, and they're looking at a future where they're going, their value is determined by an economic system that they can't relate to. So I think a lot of, when I talk to young people, I don't know that they can articulate it so well, but I feel that actually it's them trying to course correct the culture. It's that last kind of connection to a more kind of intrinsic set of values that they remember from their childhood, of, you know, how they want to be, how they want to express themselves, and they can see a future in which that's all starting to close down. So I think that that is kind of what we're working with. We're working with that really, really deep material that is very old, hundreds of years old, and a culture that you know, systemically, you do have to make a living. You have to make money in order to stay alive. There are very, very few options now for you to live without being inside of that system.
Yeah, thank you, Inez, for really getting to the root of it and acknowledging the history. One of the assumptions in mainstream economic thinking is just the like ever prevalence of capitalism, and that it's kind of like ahistorical. So I really appreciate you bringing in the historical and the process, which is often called the enclosure of the commons. And then I also love this reframing that folks have done. Instead of saying that there was a process of primitive accumulation where there were initial land theft, slavery, colonization, people have reframed that to say ongoing processes of accumulation because of how it continues, right?
Yeah.
It's ever ongoing, and it really is a natural feature of the system of the growth industrial society or of capitalism. And so, of course, coming from that, there's the call to return to commons, to have access to commons, to land, to be able to have community sovereignty. And then I'm also really hearing what you said about children and young people. And I'm thinking of Genevieve Vaughn, who's a leader in the international gift economy, the Feminists for an International Gift Economy movement. And she shares that when people are born and they grow up as children, they're really in the gift paradigm. There's so
Yeah.
much gift giving from parents to children and families, right? Children aren't charged rent, etc. And then
Yeah.
it's the exchange paradigm that is indoctrinated into us. Like, what is it that you can get for what you give? And to give not for what you can't, what you give, not for the other person, but for what you receive. So
Mm.
yeah, thank you for bringing up that socialization and that path as young people. And one of the things that I love is that you call yourself a barefoot economist. And I sometimes introduce myself as a renegade economist. So I love all these kind of like challenging mainstream economic thinking. And I believe Barefoot Economist comes from one of your teachers, Manfred Max Neef. So I'm wondering if you could introduce us to Manfred Max Neef, to that story, and why he, and maybe you as well, are called a barefoot economist.
Yes, thank you. So Manfred Max Neef, he's unfortunately no longer with us. He died a few years ago. He was a Chilean economist who had studied at Harvard, was teaching at Berkeley, when at some point in the 80s, he started working in Latin America, in Peru. And he was working with some of the poorest people on the planet. And he was in this community, and one day it had rained and rained and rained, and the ground all around had turned into mud. And when the rain stopped, he went outside into the village. And there he found himself standing opposite a young man. He knew that this young man had a wife and 4 children and a mother-in-law to feed. He had no job. And he was standing there with no shoes on, with his bare feet in the mud. And Manfred had this epiphany. He suddenly realized that everything he knew as a mainstream economist really was meaningless to this man. Should he be telling him that he should be glad because GDP has risen? I mean, none of that made any sense. And he realized that he describes it as looking into the eyes of poverty and having nothing to say. And it brought up such a kind of shame in him that he realized he needed to find a language with which he could describe economic realities for those people. So he went away, and for a couple of years, he worked with a number of other economists to come up with a language of fundamental human needs. And that's why it's called barefoot economists, because what he says is that economists need to stand with their bare feet in the mud, like the people they are trying to help, rather than sitting in ivory towers, pushing numbers around and trying to. He says, the reality is on the ground, and it must start from the grassroots. So that's what barefoot. That's where the word barefoot economist comes from. And Barefoot Economics, or Human Scale Development, as it's otherwise known, centers the economy and economic success around how well our needs are met. And it defines 9 fundamental needs, which are subsistence. So our bodies need to be able to stay alive. We have a need for freedom and autonomy. We have a need for affection and love. We have a need for identity. We need to know who we are. We have a need for idleness. We need to have time to relax. We have a need for protection, to feel safe, a need for participation, so to join in and to have a voice. We have a need for understanding, to make sense of the world, and we have a need for creation, to express ourselves. So when I work with people, we go quite slowly into each of these needs. Now, what does it mean to express oneself? What does it mean to really have a need for creation met? And what does it feel like? So when we talk about the economy, we rarely think about what the economy feels like on the inside. We're very often busy with numbers, with employment, with housing, with a lot of kind of external things. And we rarely ask, what does it actually feel like to actually have a need met? And what he did was he distinguished between needs and satisfiers. So the needs are what we all share, but satisfiers are endless. So the needs are, in this model, 9 needs, but we have endless ways to satisfy those needs, and they're determined by our culture and our kind of material conditions. So the way we meet our need in San Francisco or in the UK, where I am, is going to be radically different from the way we meet our needs in Borneo or in Japan, for example. So that was really the kind of his major contribution to this discussion around alternative economics.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I love that you're a storyteller and can just put us right there in that story. of Manfred Max Neef. And as you were sharing that story, I was reminded of another, we could say renegade economist, E.F. Schumacher, who really had a similar experience of being a mainstream economist who was then in he was in Southeast Asia, and he just had a similar awakening, which led to his book Small is Beautiful, and the idea of appropriate technology, which really has a similar vein to Barefoot Economics. How can technology and economics serve people and human needs rather than growth of GDP? And so, yeah, just think about all the mainstream economists that have had kind of an awakening in moments from their experiences in other countries. And I also do love how you're bringing up his offering, Manfred Max Neef and his team's offering around needs. And as you shared them, I wanted to remind us that he really frames them really in more of like a circle, more like a holistic form rather than the triangle. I mention that because often when we say needs, we think about the pyramid, right? The pyramid of needs. So Manfred Max Neef is really his work really rethinks it in terms of a circle and says that all of these needs are important. So I think that's one piece. And then really, like you're saying, this contribution being, how do we meet our needs? And how do we meet our needs by place? And that is different. And this goes back to our original question that I asked you about, like this tension between having our values and our sense of purpose, and this tension of meeting our needs. And what I think human scale development, Barefoot Economics, Manfred Max Neef and his team's work really liberates us from the constraints of the commodification of our needs and the financialization of our needs, and offers us other ways to think about how we meet our needs and other potentials. So let's dive in to satisfiers, pseudo satisfiers, that whole world. What does Manfred Max Neef and his team in human scale development, what do they say about how we meet our needs? What's the offering there?
Yes. So what he was doing with that work was to help people kind of take the concept of needs kind of apart a little bit. So when you ask people, what do you need? We tend to actually reel off satisfiers. Oh, I need a nice house. I need a job. I need a dog for company. But actually, those things in the model are not needs. Actually, even food is not a need. Subsistence is a need. And what that does is incredibly important, because there are any number of ways to eat food, to consume food. There are any number of ways to grow food, and they all have a different impact on the framework. So, for example, if I decide to get a ready meal, shove it in the oven, and sit in front of the telly eating it, that's completely fine. A lot of us do it. It's the end of the day, you're knackered, and you're just going to watch some, Friends and eat your ready meal. But that's a different quality of food from the food I might eat if I invite you over for dinner and I've made a meal myself and we're all sitting around. That has a different quality. And what that means is that you can start to think, okay, what is the impact of these different ways of eating food having on the economy, on people, and on the planet? So you can start to pick things apart. Because quite often when we say, oh, we need how, like in the kind of in the economics, it's like housing. Well, there's different ways to be housed. Is the housing that we are getting, if we're going to use our resources to invest in building houses, is it actually meeting people's needs? So if you build houses where everyone's in a row with a small piece of garden and a front door that shuts, which is a very common thing in the West, you get a certain kind of culture growing up around that. And people talk a lot about loneliness, about feeling isolated. Well, if you were to build your houses, let's say maybe around a green, maybe with some communal spaces, you might be able to meet several needs at once. So you're meeting the need for protection, but you might be also meeting the need for affection, participation. If people are able to co-design their house, they're meeting a need for creation. So what you then get is you get what Manfred Max Neef calls synergic satisfiers. So several needs are being met at once. Now, given that we have a limited planet, to actually use not pseudo satisfiers, but synergic satisfiers to meet several needs at once is also efficient. It means that you're not using your energy to meet different needs separately. So that's one of the satisfiers that he distinguishes when several needs are met at once. I'm sure listeners could think of other ways that you can have synergistic satisfiers. He also talks about pseudo satisfiers, and pseudo satisfiers are things that we do that don't quite meet a need. So when I work with people, I often just ask them to name them for me, because I'm not here to tell people what their pseudo satisfier is. But the things that are often said are shopping to meet my need for identity. I have a need for identity, I feel an urge to meet it, and the only option I find is consuming, buying something, buying a bigger car or wearing certain clothes. And people recognize for themselves that it doesn't meet their need for identity very well, but that they often don't know what the other options are. So that's what a pseudo satisfier does. And of course, a growth economy needs us to keep pseudo satisfying our needs. If we all tomorrow became very satisfied and had moderate, levels of consumption, the economy would collapse as we've created it now. But in human scale development, that would then be seen as a poor economy. So we now have this contrast between what is now considered to be a good economy, which is economic growth that we keep consuming, and in human scale development, unless the consumption is meeting needs adequately, it's actually a poor economy. And it's not only your own needs. So the criteria are that you meet your own needs and that you don't harm yourself, others, or the planet. So there's another satisfier called a violator. And that is when you do something that actually either harms yourself, others, or the earth. So to keep it in the area of food, having an industrial food system is harming our future food supply. Even if we're eating now, even if we were to discount the fact that like right now we're eating and it is meeting our need, future generations, when we deplete the soil, won't be able to meet their needs. So you are harming future generations, and that's called a violator. Situations in which there is an authoritarian government, for example, would be violating our need for freedom. So you start to see that, but in some ways, some people might say, oh, but it might feel like it's meeting someone's need for protection. Or that might be what an authoritarian government might want to present to you. But then you start to pick it apart and you see actually it's violating a need for freedom. So it's a tool with which you can get quite granular around the things that we take for granted as everyday activities and start to see how are they impacting us and are they really worth doing. So I always talk about, are we getting like satisfaction return on energy invested? It's like, is the energy we invest in these things really satisfying our needs? Or are we just doing it because we've been told to do it? We have a story that goes on. We are advertised to all day long. So that's really what it is as a tool.
Yeah, thank you for that. I love this. And I know these words may feel new or unfamiliar, but so just to say them again. So one thing that we can do as we listen is think about what is it that we think are our needs, and then looking at them and saying, okay, actually, which are needs and maybe in alignment with Manfred Max Neef's needs, and then which are the satisfiers, which are the ones that are actually satisfying a need. And then this idea of synergistic satisfiers, I think of permaculture and stacking functions, right? These ways we can meet multiple needs through a satisfier. And then the ways that we pseudo satisfy. For me, what comes to mind personally is like social media as not an adequate need for maybe a belonging or affection. But yeah, what are the pseudo satisfiers in your life? The ways that you maybe attempt to meet a need, but it doesn't quite meet it. And then the ways that we violate our own other needs or the planet's needs or other human needs. And I really loved that invitation to think about violators, because what that encourages is systemic thinking. In order to know that there is violation of our own needs or other people's needs or the planet's needs, we have to think systemically. And we also have to get to know our systems more. How does the food system work? Or where is this, the minerals in my cell phone from? Like, we have to think a little bit more systemically in order to feel in to whether there is violation happening. So I just gave some examples for us to think about, but I also know that you do this work in groups and with communities. And I got to experience this as a workshop, and it was so profound to be with a group of people and reflect together. And it really brings in appreciative inquiry and gratitude and a real sense of like self, or sorry, not self, community empowerment and community sovereignty and community sufficiency. So tell us about how you or somebody might bring human scale development, barefoot economics to a group.
Yes. So, well, the way I have been doing it is that we, what we have to agree on as a group is that there is a relationship between our perception of the world and how the world is, so that there is a kind of ongoing dynamic between what we're perceiving and how the world is actually responding. So, to give an example of that, if you grow up in this world where all the doors are always shut and the idea that privacy is a very important value in a lot of Western countries, which is different from a lot, I don't know, when you've traveled to other places where people have a very different sense of privacy. So those things are sort of culture. There's the sort of cultural determinants in that story. And we are all born somewhere. We are all born somewhere already existing with that story. And so we're coming to our needs with a story about how they should be met. And that's where it becomes quite interesting, because particularly when you're in a group at Schumacher College, where there's a lot of different cultures, you start to see that different people have different ideas about how those needs need to be met. But the important point about doing this work in a group is that you start to see that a lot of things that the dominant culture now tells us are individual problems really are systemic problems. So when people talk about their isolation or their loneliness, you can see, oh, well, a lot of people will talk about that. And we have tended to make that something that, you might go to, if you have a mental health problem, you go to a psychotherapist or you go to a counselor. But in actual fact, if we're all suffering from certain mental health issues, these issues must be systemic in the culture. They can't just be, something that we're all individually suffering from. And you can start to see maybe where the pseudo satisfiers are, maybe how is the culture violating some of our needs. And then it allows us to start to act together around these systemic issues. And what it also does, which I think is really beautiful, is that it allows people to see where they are economic actors, even when they don't have, let's say, a job, or they don't have a lot of money. Because one of the things that this culture tends to do, as I said earlier, it tends to equate our value with how much money or how many possessions we have. But when you start to look at the needs model, you start to see that, if you are a parent taking care of your children, you're meeting their need for affection and identity. And that's incredibly important. There could be nothing more important than what you're doing. And it's not that you are not important, but the story that we have, excuse me, has been orchestrated to make you believe that you don't have any value. And I think one of the most important things we can start to do as communities is start to see where we are of value, where, in actual fact, like you said, a lot of our gifts are already meeting our needs. And it helps us to see where the obstacles are to us meeting our needs. Because what you said earlier about this being a sort of ongoing process of accumulation, I think that capitalism has to keep being reinforced. It's not our natural way of being with each other. So therefore, what you need to do in a capitalist society is you have to keep reinforcing this division between people. You have to reinforce the story of competition. You have to reinforce a story of scarcity. You have to reinforce a story of fear, that you must fear other people. And then people get separated, and then they start to rely more on the system than on each other. But in human scale development, in groups, very often people just look around and realize it is us that we need. It's the people who make the economy. We are the economy, along with the natural resources that we need. But a lot of our social needs are met by each other. And so how do we find our way back to each other? That is really the question that kind of arises from the work.
How do we find a way back to each other? How beautiful. Yeah. And just to make this again an invitation for us listening, feel free to get in with a group, a community that you're in, a collective or group, and really do this work together of how are our needs being met? How are we doing? Like, where are we abundant, or where is there a lot of, ability to meet our needs? And then where are we having not as easy ability to meet our needs? And then what are the ways that we could do this work together? And then what are the systemic changes that we might advocate for? And it can be really empowering and also just really enlightening to know I'm not alone. And like you said, this is not my individual problem. It's actually, there's others who are experiencing this. And I love that you've learned from Manfred Max Neef and his team, his community, and then you've developed this work and brought it into these many forms that you described in your garden. And we're going to share an article that you've written, communities as hothouses for regenerative culture. We're going to share that in the chat. But maybe just share us, how has your own thinking and practice evolved over time from human scale development, maybe since I last saw you? How has it evolved? What insights, what additions, what evolutions have come from your work?
Mm. Yes. So I've been doing this for about maybe 14 years now, I think. I can't remember when you were in my class, Della, but it's been a while. And I guess when I'm working with groups, we do a lot of visioning for how we would like to meet our needs met, because one of the things that is important in human scale development is this idea that communities know how they want their needs to be met, given that if they have enough time together to explore this. What we have is these beautiful visions come up from people, because we have so many gifts to give to the world, and the workshop is an opportunity to think about what those gifts are, to think about what in the human scale development framework we talk about wealth and poverty in a very different way. So you can have a poverty in all these different needs. So you can have a poverty of affection while having a very high income, or a poverty of creation. Because we tend to think of poverty, in that way of like, being under $1 a day, or how many dollars a day. In human scale development, that is not how we look at poverty. You have people in the world who have very little money and who have very high wealth in terms of their needs being met. So we explore whether wealth is in the community, whether poverty is. And what pretty much has come up over the years is that all the beautiful ideas that we have cannot manifest themselves unless we have access to place, space, land. So I started to think, okay, what is the obstacle to us being able to do the things that we want? So one of them is land, actual places. We see that our access to land is shrinking. We're seeing more and more land grabs. We're seeing more and more land commercialized, more and more public spaces being commercialized, our education system being privatized. So what used to belong to the people is getting smaller and smaller. And in relation to that, if your public spaces, your public space, your land is shrinking, that means that you have less access to ways of meeting your needs that are outside of the economy. So you end up having to give more of your time to the economy. So now we see that people on 2 incomes still can't afford to buy a home. So you're having to work more and more hours to kind of service this exploitative economy. So what I was watching was just people with brilliant ideas shrinking. Their world was shrinking. The opportunities to create change were shrinking. So that's where I came up with this, what I call the regenerative triad. So regenerative space is a space that we have to meet our needs in harmony with the world and regenerate the world. And that requires time, and that requires actual land. So if that's shrinking, then what are the ways that we can start to push back against that? So I became aware that within the groups that I worked with, and not all of them, but often they were activist groups, there was kind of a division between what people thought was real activism and the kind of rest of the stuff. So when people were kind of called to think about how they were going to change things, there was generally a movement in the direction of protest or legal action. And I realized, well, actually, that's not enough. So in the triad, there is a space for the legal action and the protest. And I call that the space of restoring. It's restoring justice, it's restoring equity. And that is where we look at on a kind of systemic level, what are the things that should really be our birthright, like the commons, clean water, clean air, access to, a non-authoritarian internet. Those are kind of things that really we need right now, that we should have access to and we should have a say over. So in that space of restoring, we're looking at restoring those kind of commons back to the people. But we don't need only that, we also need to be connecting back to the local. So we need to be building our local economy. We need to connect back to the people and the place that make up our communities. So I call that the place of connection, where we're building local economic structures to meet our needs in. And those two things, even the kind of building the local economy is seen as a kind of form of being active. But the place that's mostly missing, I found, was the place that I think we need now more than anything is healing. So part of those three, one of the three nodes is the node of healing. And that is where we gather together to actually heal the trauma that capitalism has imposed on us. And that is, sometimes physical trauma, but often that's emotional trauma, the way that we have been separated from each other. So that's where we need, artists, we need healers, we need musicians, we need poets, we need people who can gather us together. And the three nodes, they form the regenerative triad, because they kind of work together in the sense that unless we have land and we have spaces in the commons, we don't have anywhere to build stuff. And if we don't have anywhere to build stuff, we don't have places to actually heal. But at the same time, if we don't have places to heal, we don't have the strength to do the rest of that work. So I've been working now with people to think of, in your community, in your activism work, are you finding enough people or enough time to fulfill those three areas? You might be doing a lot of legal action, maybe you're doing a lot of protest on the street, but do you have time for healing? Are there enough healers in your community? Maybe you're doing, lots of local economic work, but is there actually enough land for you to do it in? How are those three areas fitting together? And it helps people to see where the kind of gaps are in their groups and where they might be sort of be able to put more energy. So I was recently talking to a group and they say, that healing node is kind of a luxury. It's when we have extra time, then maybe we spend time listening to each other. And they actually realize that actually they need to make time for that as, as something they can really focus on, rather than seeing it as an add-on, as a luxury to their activism work.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for bringing that regenerative triad in for us. Restore, connect, and heal. Those are really the invitations for us to co-create regenerative cultures and futures together. So let's make it just very clear what that connection is between the regenerative triad that you offer and regenerative livelihood. Because I can see some connections already, but for those of us listening who are really trying to figure out our regenerative livelihood gardens, maybe listening for what's next, or how to care for our garden, or how to serve in this time. What can we learn from the regenerative triad by way of giving us direction or insight into our regenerative livelihood paths?
Yeah. So the regenerative triad was something I created as a way to think of like how this world that is shrinking, how we can start expanding. So I guess when we think of regenerative livelihoods, there is the now and there is a future that we want. And there is a tension between the two, because right now, unless you have a piece of land, unless you have access to your own food, you're probably working for money. And then who do you want to be working for? And I guess maybe with the regenerative triad, there's an opportunity to think, what is that regenerative livelihood? Where am I best placed? Am I someone who has the skills to, build the local economy? Am I that kind of person? Do I understand the needs of my community? Do I have those qualities? Do I have access to the resources I need to do that kind of work? And you could say the same, or maybe I'm the kind of person who really needs to do the restoring justice work. That's where my energy is right now. I have the skills for that. Or maybe I'm someone who needs to be in the field of healing, which is, as I said, very kind of quietly doing its work behind the scenes. And maybe that's the quality that I can bring. So that could be a way of trying to explore where you are best placed to contribute to a regenerative culture. And the reason I came up with the regenerative triad, just to kind of backtrack a bit, is because a lot of the talk about regenerative cultures I found was happening in areas where people weren't necessarily thinking about social justice. I mean, we all need to connect to the land, we all need to connect to the ecology, but for some people, they are just hanging on by a bare thread. You know, they are just hanging on by their fingernails to life. And trying to talk about ecology is really just way outside of what they are able to absorb. So when you are in a very precarious housing situation, studies have shown that basically, you know, your brain starts to your brain capacity starts to shrink. Your capacity to make decisions that are productive and are going to get you out of the situation actually starts to narrow. So the outside world is actually determining what's happening in your brain. So when we talk about regeneration, and let's say we talk about how we need to be, you know, better stewards of the land, that message is not going to land with people who are really struggling to just meet that fundamental need of housing. So we need to start thinking that's where the kind of the justice part comes into it. And this is where we can get a lot more people on board if we start to actually address those inequalities. And then we can bring people into that healing. So there's different ways in which we can start to touch into the system and start making changes. Yeah, did that answer the question, or did I go off on a tangent there? I'm not quite sure.
No, yeah, we were talking about the regenerative triad and how it relates to regenerative livelihoods. And yeah, one thing I'm hearing is like if we feel into our need to restore, to connect and heal, where are you feeling called, right?
Yeah.
Where is your work feeling called, your energy, so to speak? Another way to think of it too is to look at the plants in our own regenerative livelihood garden and sense into which of those three offerings is each plant contributing to. That can be another way. And to recognize the diversity, right? So that we don't have to do everything, but like, what is it that we can do? What is the area that we can contribute in? And I really love them. I love the connecting part. To me, the word remembering comes up, like reconnecting to ourselves, to our bodies, to rhythms, to nature, to each other, right? And then healing of land, healing of connection, of community, of spiritual traditions, etc. So all of that is very beautiful. The one that I'm thinking of, the restore piece, I've just been thinking a lot about how under capitalism, no matter what the activist efforts lead to in terms of, public health care or education or certain mutual aid or safety nets, under the current system, they can continually to be under scrutiny, or even be broken away. Like, I'm thinking of where you are in the United Kingdom and the NHS, and like it just seems to be continuously under attack. So the word restore to me like implies like a restoration, but until to what point? And have we ever gotten to the systemic situations that really create the conditions for growing good lives? So for me, the restore, I wonder if there's a different word where it's like not just restore, but like move forward and like solidify or secure, right? So that human rights and the commons and universal access to services are not then re-eroded by neoliberal capitalism and the state. So that's the one where I'm like, to restore to what? And then what about like to move forward or to progress or to like stabilize? That's the one that I'm having a little bit of like a what if question too.
Yeah. I mean, I see what you mean. I guess it's that requires a kind of remembering of our birthright. That we don't have to be begging to have what we need. You know, we, each of us, we each have a right to have our needs met. And I don't mean that in a sort of like, because it can sound like, just wondering how to, it's not entitlement, but we're here, and if there is enough, it should be shared by all. You see, if there's a situation in which there isn't enough, then the suffering also needs to be shared by all. And right now we have a situation, that's the restoring of what I mean. It's like, you know, the what are we restoring to? We're restoring it into a balance of equity, so that there aren't some people who have more than others, which is, I think, also very hard for us sometimes to imagine, because we have been indoctrinated into a situation in which we believe that there are people who are better than others, or people who are more entitled than we are. And I think so some of that is also an internal shift that needs to happen, and a sense of feeling that you know, the earth, not that it's just here for us, but we are part of the earth. We should be able to thrive if that thriving is available, if the resources are available to us. And so, yeah, but I'm very happy to look at those words in more detail, because it's not a fixed piece, and I'm always willing to learn and see if there's a better way of describing that particular node of the triad. So thank you.
Yeah. And I'm just going to ask one more question from me, and then we'll have plenty of time for folks who are listening who want to weave in their thoughts, insights, and questions. So the one last question that I want to ask you is that, you know, sharing this view for me feels so resonant, and likely for those of us listening. Yet how do we scale and share this view more broadly? What are the ways that we can communicate about these ideas and invite others into this regenerative triad work of our time, and also this really beautiful effort of cultivating regenerative livelihoods for regenerative cultures? What is it that you can offer or invite us into how we can really expand and grow in a good way, not bad growth, this movement and this effort?
Oh, that's $1 million question, Della. How do we grow? It's I spend a lot of time thinking about, well, really, I came to this work because of a deep concern for the future of my child. You know, I realized what was happening with the climate 17 years ago. My son was a little baby in my lap. I was like, well, holy shit, forgive my words. I thought, this is not good. And I was baffled, because I thought, if this is sort of public knowledge, and I'm watching this, I was watching a movie with other people, then why is that not enough? You know, why is it not enough to know the facts about things? And that's really what got me into the needs work, because I thought it's not enough to know what's happening, how bad an action might be, because if your needs are kind of wrapped up in the system and you haven't got other options to meet your needs, you're going to meet your needs. You know, if your need for identity is done through shopping and nobody's giving you another option, then, you know, you're going to shop. So I think for me, I at some point really moved away from talking about the climate crisis, because I kind of felt like people were either on board or they weren't. And actually, if they weren't, there was kind of no point. But what I realized, that the conversation I can always have with people is, how are you? How is this system working for you? Are you actually happy? And not in a sort of superficial way, but like, is it really fulfilling to spend 60 hours at work and not seeing your children? You know, it's like, why are we doing this? And there's different ways of framing it, but basically, I think I've just spent the last sort of 14 years just asking people how they're doing, and then saying, hey, let's look at how you're doing with this particular need. Is the way that your life is set up actually allowing you to meet this need or these needs? Because I believe that you and I and everyone in the world has these needs and has a right to have them met. And I find that conversation is always a rich conversation. I don't have to tell anyone anything about that capitalism doesn't work, they won't say to me, even if they're arch capitalists, they won't say, oh, capitalism doesn't work, but they will say that actually they feel very, very lonely, that they feel often that they're working too much, that if I'm in the right setting with people, they will say that, maybe they regret some of the choices they made in their careers because it took them away from their dreams. And we start to talk about just what makes them human. And I think that if that's the conversation we can start having, then, because I often call my work economics from the inside out, because when you start to feel into what's happening with our needs right now, then the kind of movement towards, well, for one thing, very often the movement is towards more connection with others, realizing that my needs are met often through connection. And then why is it that it's so hard for me to connect? Why are there no places where I can gather anymore? Why am I so busy with work? Why am I distracted by my phone all the time? Why is this technology constantly making me want more? And that's kind of, it doesn't come from someone else telling you that you should get off your phone. It starts to come from a sense that actually this doesn't satisfy me. And the language of human scale development for me was just, as a storyteller, it was like, I need the words with which I can describe what's going on. And when I give, like, I've worked with lots of young people, and I give teenagers the word pseudo satisfier, they're like, oh, it's this, it's this. They know it, but they didn't quite know how to describe this feeling of constantly reaching for something and feeling still kind of empty. So I would say that I don't know how to scale things up. I don't know. There's kind of ways in which, but I think that having conversations that center around needs is a real way of connecting with people. And what I think we need more than anything now is real human connection as the foundation for all these gardens. That's the soil that our ideas can grow in. So yeah, maybe that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I love that, I asked that question about scaling while the idea is called human scale development. It really, the answer is in the title that, human connection must come at human scale, right? So it is that reconnecting and healing and restoring our communities, really, and then sharing out the ways that we are doing that, the storytelling, as you're saying. And that story of you sitting and watching the film, I actually remember that from your class like 10 years ago. And you framed it as this, like, why is it that some people are touched by certain things? I think it was the film An Inconvenient Truth, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, why is it that some things touch us and some don't? And so just to appreciate for all of us listening, whatever those moments were of awakening, whatever the kind of unlearning or the challenging our, mainstream economic thinking that came to us, just some gratitude for those moments, those teachers, those books, those films, and also a little bit of appreciation for this idea that, we may not know the ripple effects of our actions. Just as that film touched and sparked you on this journey, so might our work do the same, or our conversations. Joanna
Yeah.
Macy says, any act with good intention sends out ripple effects into the web of life in ways we cannot measure or even see. Go ahead, Inez. What were you going to say?
No, it's so beautiful. But it also reminds me, I'm reading this wonderful book by Nicholas Christakis called Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of, oh, oh God, it's my brain, just of a good society, the evolutionary origins of a good society. And he says something wonderful in there, because they have a lab in the States, a social science lab, where they do all these experiments on how things spread through a population, because you're asking about how we scale things up. And he basically talks about how the way that we treat someone, let's say I go and buy a coffee and I am friendly, or someone's friendly to me, I get this sort of like, sense of, oh, it's a good day, and then I'm going to be friendly to someone else. And it kind of that you don't know how you treat someone, how that's going to ripple through that community. In the same way that if you treat someone in an unkind way, it also has its ripple. And he says, basically, our generosity and kindness is like a virus. It runs through the community, and you don't know, like a virus, when you've hung out with someone and that someone you don't know how it gets to you. But that is a much that's a set of connections that you're not even aware of. Someone that I don't know is affecting how my day is going to go because they were kind to someone. They were generous, they were friendly, or they were unkind to someone. And I really love his work actually around that. It makes me remember that even when we think, oh, I can't offer much to this big problem, it's like actually every little thing we do offers something, and we will never know the effects of our actions, of our hopefully kind actions to people. So I think that's also a thing to bear in mind when we're faced with such an enormous, overwhelming challenge, that it's not, that it's kind of invisible, it's mysterious. So
Beautiful. Yeah, let's all go out and make someone's day and see the ripple effects. So want to turn to now folks listening, and I'm going to uplift some things in the comments. Just for folks watching the recording, they won't be able to see what has been shared. So I just want to share, one person shared, how about instead of restore, something like regeneration or transformation. And they reminded us of the move from restorative justice to transformative justice. So something in that framing being useful. We had Sylvia do beautiful work aligning the triad, the regenerative triad, with the three dimensions of the great turning. So saying, oh, the holding actions element, this comes from the work that reconnects and the work of Joanna Macy, but the holding actions is really that restoring the Gaian structures, or the shift in systems is really that connecting and like creating things that are more regenerative, and in alignment with healthy thriving cultures and societies. And then the third dimension of the great turning, this shift in consciousness, really in alignment with healing, and the transformation of mind. So thank you, Sylvia, for that synthesis that you're weaving for us. We had Jeanette really also reflect quite synchronistically around poverty and wealth, and just the perception of our mind, and appreciating how you brought up the reframe of poverty and wealth in terms of human scale development. And then we had Joey speak about the move from ownership to stewardship when it comes to land and reconnection with land. And then we had the blueprint book, Between Us, How Cultures Create Emotions, and the book Together Resilient. Those were some of the books recommended for those of us listening. So I'd love to hear from folks, whoever wants to share. Maybe Joey, may I call on you first? You had so many beautiful things that you shared. I'd love to hear how this is impacting you, and any questions that you may have, or what you're learning as you listen.
Sure. Thank you very much for being here, all of you. Um, so I'm right now in the GEDS program. So I've been dealing with Sylvia, and I'm also in another class called Principles and Practices for Deep Transformation. So that's part of Gaia as well. And now I'm trying to move into this class into January. So yeah, I'm just at a point in my life where I'm trying to change my worldviews, and as I've mentioned in these other classes, I've always wanted to be part of the eco village movement, that kind of lifestyle where I could work, design, live, travel around to different eco villages. But I've always lived in the city my whole life. I have two kids. They live very close to me, so that's why I'm here. Once my kids are older, I'll probably move on. But I guess the biggest thing for me is the last comment I put in there for this webinar today. I just feel that we have to really be doing inner work. And I think that humans as a whole, were at a specific level of consciousness that is allowing us to be exactly where we are right now. And I don't think that that can be changed. Any of these complex problems can be changed until we reach a much higher level of consciousness. And I think it's up to each person how to do that. There's not a really set blueprint, but I think until we make that leap, that these problems are just going to keep getting worse. And pretty much as a society for 200 years, 400 years, whatever you want to call it, we've always been trying to solve these problems outside of ourselves. And I think now it's time that we move to the inner work. And then that's what we're going to have to do individually. And then that's going to have an effect on the collective. And then we're going to start doing it collectively. And that gets big enough where we move into a whole new space. It would be like the equivalent of going to another planet where none of these problems exist, and they live in this perfect universe, which of course doesn't exist, but where these problems just don't exist. And I think we can be in that kind of place, but I think that humans are not at that level to do it at this point. So that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Joey.
Yeah.
Beautiful. And is anything you want to respond or share?
I find myself nodding. Yes, a lot of this is inner work, and inner work that I think we've been ignoring. I think it's there's a lot more interest in somatics now, in the kind of the body, and I think that there is kind of more of a movement towards healing. And at the same time, what I find is that in order for us to heal, we need to have places in which to do the healing. So this is where it comes back to this, like, how do we also gain the places back? That's why it's a triad, and all of each of those nodes is as important as the other. So I agree absolutely that we need to have time to be with what's happening inside of us. We have a very kind of like culture that's got to do all the time. So yes.
Wonderful. Who else would like to share either a reflection or a thought or a question? Maybe Natalia, do you want to share? I know you're actually a somatic coach. Could be very related. Anything you want to add or ask?
Yeah, I mean, thank you. I had written down a question, Della, that you actually asked about how do we invite this conversation or these concepts to individuals that aren't quite happy with the status quo, but can't really imagine a different way, right? And so in my work as a coach, a lot of what I hear is around burnout and around boundaries around work, how you were mentioning, and as of working 60 hours a day and not spending time with your kids or doing anything that feels good. And having people constantly say or have this belief of it's just always been this way. How do I change so I can handle it better? So I have more time, so I can be a good parent and still work 60 hours a day, right? And so I'm always interested in how to gently and caringly invite this insight without overwhelming or without challenging too strongly, because it's such a delicate feel like emotion that they're going through in that tension.
Yeah, I so relate to what you're saying, and this trying to figure out at which point what do you offer people at which point in their journey, because and that's a kind of delicate assessment of the situation. So for example, part of my work at the moment is in some ways not related at all to this, and in some ways it really very much is. So I started a project called Tales to Live By in Plymouth, which is the city nearest to where I live, and it's all about people with mental health issues, gathering them together in a very sort of celebratory way, because even if you have mental health problems, doesn't mean you have to always be kind of focused on the negative, in a celebratory way to tell their story and to hear other people's stories or to share a poem. And it's really about building community mental health, because one of the things in the team that I'm in, we said we don't want to be ghettoizing people and saying, oh, if you have a mental health, you go there and those are your services. It's like, if there are mental health issues, it's because in the community there are mental health issues. So what does the community need to do? And that's because I want our communities to become resilient and politicized and aware of the structural nature of why so many people are suffering. But if I came in with that to start with, before we had bonded together and had the strength of community together, then nobody would listen, or people would be totally overwhelmed by that. But I just feel like, okay, I'm going to do that healing work. I'm going to do in that area. We just Don't overwhelm people with mental health issues with other things. Just help them to heal. And then when they're healed, and they somewhat healed, it's hard to heal in a dysfunctional society. When that capacity, that space inside them grows, which has been shrunk, then maybe there will be more opportunity for another stage of action. But one of the things I have noticed with a lot of the anxiety we're feeling, let's say around the climate or biodiversity loss or any number of catastrophes we seem to be facing, is that when they feel very strong in us, we want to tell someone so that they feel strongly, without realizing that maybe that's not the right time, or they're in a different part of their journey and it's going to incapacitate them. And that's why I created the regenerative triad. It's like, work out where people are. Where are they? Where are they best placed? Don't feel that, because each of us has had that moment of like, oh shit, we've got to do something, but in different ways at different times. And it's about being skillful, about knowing what can I do. And I think there has to be an inner capacity and an assessment of what is the inner capacity. And the inner capacity of each of us, I think, grows in relation to others. So we are more when we're together. So gather. My thing is like, just come together and have fun. I often start my projects, even if they are kind of they're going to get political along the line, with like, let's bake some bread together, or let's celebrate. There's something I really love at the moment, an idea that's called life houses. And I can't remember, I'm very bad with names, the name of the guy who's about to publish a book about it. And he says the spaces we now have, like old churches, they should be brought into the community as emergency spaces when, things get really tricky, which they will for everyone at some point. And my thought about that was, yeah, that's great. But why don't we think of them as places to celebrate first? Let's make them the places where we gather in joyful celebration. Hey, but we're also making sure that there's going to be enough water, enough food, and all of that stuff. But, the kind of way of creating attractive invitations for people to be together, rather than, as a storyteller, I know that the truth is not always the best way to get action. Just because we know that something is true, it doesn't mean that it's the skillful way of getting people in the right place. So, yeah.
Thank you so much. I wrote down that question of what do I offer people at which point in their journey, as I'm carrying that with me into my work. So thank you.
Well, great.
Thank you so much. Beautiful. Yeah, and I'll add one way I'd share that as well is I always listen for a question, right? Instead of sharing what I think someone needs, I listen for what is their inquiry or wondering. I think that can be a helpful guide. And then I also heard, this invitation from Mia Birdsong the other day around how instead of the first time you talk to your neighbor being in time of a ecological crisis or a conflict, like turn the music down, let us have the first time we talk to our neighbors be celebration or welcoming or connection. So just like you're saying around space. So Dave, I see Dave has a question for us. Go ahead, Dave. Welcome. You're still muted. We can't hear you yet. There you go.
Hear me now? Yeah. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, that last one of the last things there, someone said about being stronger together. I definitely have that as feelings, strong feeling that sort of feel isolated. And when I do go on kind of events that are with groups that have like-minded interest, and I feel like a different person, really. So I feel like I'm all completely converted to all this, all these ideas, but it just feels so frustrating that it's actually quite hard to get into this togetherness. I mean, I live out in the countryside in a village. That I went to Findhorn to do the course in permaculture last year, and that's where I really felt that was fantastic. But one of the things I learned up there was that the eco village and the eco houses there, I think they said that the second most costly houses as an area in Scotland, outside somewhere in the middle of Edinburgh, was Findhorn Eco Village. And it just feels like there's something really, you know, I know you have to be part of that system, but if the actual healing places are like, you know, so hard to get into because the cost, and so to come and live in this community and feel that togetherness and feel, yeah, you know, you feel a lot stronger that way. Yeah, it's beyond the reach of a lot of people. And I just happen to be in a stage in my life where I actually can think about moving a lot more easily now, but that wouldn't probably be something I could afford up there. And well, since Brexit, people from Britain can't even go to most European countries to live anymore like we used to be able to. We're not even allowed to do that without a visa. So yeah, it seems quite a big challenge. I sort of feel, yeah, I'm listening to all the reasoning and the talk, you know, the things. I think, yeah, I agree with that, but I want to get to one of these places and live that life, you know. But it's not so easy, is it?
Yeah, I think you're saying exactly what I've been hearing for the last decade or so from people. Is like, yeah, why is it not possible to do all these beautiful things that we want to do? And there are systemic reasons for that, and they are, you know, in one word, like land grabs. Basically, what should be everyone's is in the hands of a few. They determine how our food is grown, how we live, how our money operates. They are in charge. We don't really have functioning democracies. We have these faux democracies, and this is why the restore function of that triad is really important. We do need to fight back. It is not just going to be nice. And yeah, I don't know if that fits with a sort of Buddhist philosophy, but I do think that we're seeing is if we don't put our bodies on the line, if we don't have people who are rising up, they will just bulldozer all over us. And they're doing it all over the world to Indigenous people, to the people of the world. And so my message always is to people, and this is where I think the environmental movement has missed a beat, is that what's happening to the earth is happening to human beings. It is the same extractive process. So when we feel all shrunk inside, it's because we're under capitalism. It has to keep taking from us, and we are just the stuff that it takes from. If we start to see that that's happening, our power is together. Our power is saying no together. But of course, we're divided. We're distracted. We're divided. There are very few places for us to gather in. So it's a kind of matter of pushing back, and that pushing back needs to happen collectively. And in the chapter, I explain it a little bit more. I explain also the example. Can I say that about Puerto Rico Della, in the chapter? I mentioned that.
Go ahead.
Useful, yeah. So my dad's from Puerto Rico. And in 2017, there's been several other hurricanes, but the worst one was Maria, and it flattened the country. But it wasn't just that it was a hurricane that, you know, happened. It was already a disaster waiting to happen because it was a hollowed out economy. It was in a lot of debt. It had this debt restructuring. The grid was already kind of very decayed over many decades of no investment. So when Hurricane Maria struck, it was kind of like a million times worse than if it had been in a country where things had been invested in. So these disasters, when they happen, if they happen to places where there's already such a terrible hollowing out of the economy, are much worse. And then what happens is, of course, the disaster capitalists move in, and they then want to kind of like do the same thing. They want to grab what's there, privatize, and take advantage. What happened in Puerto Rico, which I was excited about, even though it was happened because of the terrible conditions was that a lot of people started to organize, and there was a lot of people who were connected to Puerto Rico who fundraised. The American government did practically nothing for many, many days. Lots of people died because of that who shouldn't have died. But on the ground in Puerto Rico, people started helping each other out. So after 8 days, there was no electricity. Well, the mayor of San Sebastian gathered together all the retired electricians, and within a few months, they'd restored the grid. People started gathering together in mutual aid hubs. They were trying to get clean water. They were teaching the population how to clean their water. They were also offering the healing modality of giving trauma healing, massages, artwork, crafts, and they were politicizing the situation. They were helping people understand that the reason it was so bad in Puerto Rico was a structural thing. You know, they were doing that thing of focusing on restoration, on restoring justice. And I think it has, I believe, enlivened a kind of political movement in Puerto Rico against the disaster capitalists trying to move in. And I think that's kind of where we have to really come together and understand that we are dealing with, they're not personal forces. It's not one person doing this, but the way capitalism rewards people is it rewards people to keep destroying things. And if we don't want it to do that, we can't, there are going to be times when we can't just be nice about it, and we can't ask nicely. And what we're seeing is people losing their lives all over the world because they are standing up for the right for us to live in peace on the planet. And it's you know, that's not for everyone. You know, that's not for everyone. But I think it's important to acknowledge that that is part of how the system is going to change. It's going to change by pushing out, it's going to change by healing inside, and it's going to change by building. And the three elements, and I guess in Joanna Macy work, it's the holding actions. Those are, they're all three of them are important. And I think we need to start, seeing, acknowledging that even if we can't do that work, we are grateful for the people who are doing that on our behalf. There are people working right now and dying right now on our behalf so that we can live on this earth in peace. And that's not my work. You know, I'm not there. I'm not an earth defender. I'm not chaining myself to things, but some people are. And I just want to sort of show my gratitude for that and how important that is in this struggle.
Thank you, Inez. And I see that Jeanette would like to come in and add something here too. So Jeanette, welcome.
Hi, this is sort of in response to what Dave said. I came into this world in poverty and have financially, but not in spirit, and still am at that level, and I'm almost 60 years old. That's in dollars, but I don't believe myself to be in poverty. And I've worked for years to try to build community. I feel that, you know, if there's some obstacle, then that allows us the opportunity to think outside the box. And it might not be, you know, the quick fix that you might have if something was easy to get into, like a community or financially reachable, but not to give up hope, because, well, I took the Eco Village design course last year, and I wanted things to happen fast. And I know that I'm a very organized person, but I'm not real good at bringing people together. But I feel that if you can somehow get together with a group or advertise that you would want to start some kind of a land sharing situation, that with patience and thinking outside the box, that it can be possible. At this point in time, I'm lucky because in our area, I'm in the United States, and several cities around here, and maybe there's some program that's similar in other countries, I'm not sure, but there's something called the land bank. And what they're doing is it's for blighted properties or abandoned properties that people have owed back taxes on. And they're putting them up for auction with the base auction price is just what the overdue taxes are. So if there's any program like that, that might be a way to get cheaper land. There might be other government incentives for that sort of thing. And this particular one I'm looking at has a dwelling that needs refurbished. But one of the things with the land bank in particular is that they not only look at what dollar amount that you can, bid for the auction, but what the end use is. And they like owner occupied, and they also like community outreach and that kind of thing. So it's a big blessing. I don't know if we're going to get this one, but just basically, I feel like my financial poverty has given me opportunities that I never would have had if I just went down the regular route, and try not to let obstacles, have it be like a pivoting point instead of a roadblock. And I think that can be very beneficial for anybody.
Thank you so much, Jeanette. And as I'll hand over to you to respond to anything that you'd like to, but also to share any kind of closing invitations or words as we go forth.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think it's so true that we there are opportunities right in front of us that sometimes we don't see, and that we're working with what's there. We're all working with what's there, and with the knowledge that like these mysterious forces, things do change in ways that we don't always understand. And doing this work, I meet so many amazing people. There are so many amazing people doing amazing things. So it's about finding each other. It's about finding each other, and also, we're in such an extraordinary time where we are being faced with things that are, to be faced with an existential threat, and a global existential threat, is extraordinary. It's asking something of us that we don't even know probably that we're capable of doing. And I think, again, it comes down to what we're capable of doing together. And I do see shifts happening. I'm seeing a lot of shifts happening. And I don't want to sort of live with a kind of false hope that everything is going to be okay. It is going to be a very bumpy ride. Whatever we do right now, we're in for a bumpy ride. But every day is an opportunity to, there's a kind of a universe in the seed. Every day is an opportunity to see the beauty of what still exists, the opportunities that are in front of us, and to take advantage of the time that, Sam Harris, who does the Waking Up podcast, he says something that I actually used with my son. He says, "You're still in the game." See, sometimes when my son was struggling with something, I say, "Oh, just see it as a computer game. Okay, you don't want to drop down another level. Just keep going. So, okay, next time you just do better." And I see it like that. We're still in the game. We're still here. There's everything to maybe fight's not the right word, to work towards, to play towards, to be joyful towards. So to kind of keep finding that bit of fire and resilience inside of ourselves as we go forward.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Inez. And what a beautiful way to close. Thank you so much for your work, for your time today. I'm going to put in the chat one more time Inez's website, and you can also connect on LinkedIn. There's a lot of great articles and things that Inez shares there. And I'm also reminding us that this is part of the, in preparation for the course that will begin again in January through May of next year. So if you'd like to join us, we'd love to have you. The link is there too. And we'll also be sending a discount code to register for those who've signed up for this webinar. So you'll have that as well. The recording for this is going to be available and sent to you as well in case you want to listen back, listen and continue to share. But yeah, really good to be in community with you all today, and particularly right now in this time, and also to share resources, and let's continue to do that. And also, just want to share that, take the invitations as going forth, whatever you heard today. How can you integrate them and make sense of them? So whether it's exploring your own needs or the needs of your community, whether it's working with these frames of satisfiers, pseudo-satisfiers, synergistic satisfiers, or violators, try these on, integrate them into your life, really make sense of them in your own lived experience. And then finally, Dave's point or question around inclusivity and access and cost of eco-villages, my invitation would be, wherever we live, what is the way that we can connect with our neighbors or those around us and engage in celebration and mutual aid and get to know one another, and kind of build like even urban eco-village like communities wherever we are in the world. And of course, engage in that regenerative triad of restoring, connecting, and healing. So beautiful to be with you all. Thank you so much again for today, and we'll be in touch. Good to be in community with you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.